The procurement process is one of the most important steps in an ERP software implementation, but organizations often make big mistakes during the cycle. What are those mistakes? That's what I want to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. And one of the service offerings we provide to our clients is ERP software selection services. And part of the software evaluation and selection process includes the RFP process. The RFP process is when organizations put together a request for proposal, which is what RFP stands for, and they define what their needs are and what it is they're looking in a new ERP system or overall technology solution. And then software vendors that are invited to respond to the RFP will provide a proposal based on those criteria that are outlined in the RFP. Now, it sounds simple enough. It sounds like that can't be that difficult to do, but it's amazing how many mistakes organizations make through this process. So what I want to do today is talk about the 5 things that organizations commonly mess up or make mistakes in during their RFP process. One of the big procurement mistakes that are made during the RFP process with ERP software is when organizations see a bunch of demos and they see a bunch of functionality that's shown to them during the sales cycle, and when they go to get the RFP and then ultimately contract for that software, they don't align with what they saw during the demos. So a good example would be a lot of times software vendors will have multiple solutions, multiple modules they can offer you, and they'll tell you that, hey, you've got this advanced need over here, so we have this advanced module that can address that need for you, and sounds good enough, and you may actually like that advanced module. But what happens is sometimes organizations will then get the proposal and then they'll end up contracting with the ERP vendor, and it doesn't include the module that they were shown during the demo process. And then when they get into implementation, they realize they didn't get what they were shown during the demo process, and therefore they're not getting the value they expected. So this is a really tricky one because a lot of times you need to understand which modules you're looking at, which solutions you're looking at specifically, and also which version of the solutions you're looking at. Because a lot of times software vendors will start to sell you on future state stuff that isn't available yet. And so really just understanding and navigating all this can be really tricky. So one thing you want to do during the RFP process is make sure you spend a lot of time outlining and understanding what it is you saw during the demonstration cycle and what they showed you during the sales cycle, in addition to what they proposed to you in the proposal and ultimately in the contracts that are based on those proposals. Another common mistake that organizations make during the procurement cycle is that they don't realize that they're comparing incomparable solutions. In other words, there are solutions that aren't comparing apples to apples. They aren't similar solutions. So for example, you might have 2 software vendors, let's just say, that you're considering and you're evaluating as part of your RFP process. One vendor came in and provided a realistic view of what their software could do. They provided a realistic view of all the modules that would be required for you to take advantage of their capabilities. And they also have a realistic implementation timeline and realistic cost associated with their proposal. Over here, you have another vendor, though, that is more aggressive, let's just say. They've got a more aggressive sales team. They came in and really lowballed the implementation estimate. They really narrowed the scope down to cut any fluff in their cost proposal because they want to win based on cost. And oftentimes what you see is you look at these 2 numbers, you look at these 2 proposals, and you think that this option over here is a lot cheaper than this option here. But the reality is you're not comparing equal solutions. These are 2 totally different proposals, 2 totally different sets of assumptions, 2 totally different levels of realism. And it can be hard to navigate. It can be tricky if you don't know what to look for and you don't know these different solutions the way that an independent provider like our company at Third Stage might. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, that you make sure that you normalize and standardize the comparison between the different vendors. If one vendor provided a really robust solution and a couple additional modules that added to their cost, why not look at the other vendor and say, well, what if you provided something similar that provided the same amount of value? What would that cost us? That way you're getting an equal comparison. You can compare more evenly on a level playing field rather than having misleading information that you're comparing between the different solutions. Another common mistake in the ERP software procurement cycle is not recognizing and realizing some of the hidden costs in the contracts and in the proposals. And these are not necessarily intentionally hidden costs, but they're costs that are going to be real costs for you. They just may not be outlined in the proposal. I'll give you an example. A lot of times when we're going through this procurement process with clients, software vendors will have a series of assumptions in their statement of work and in their overall proposal. They might say something like, we, the vendor, are not going to be responsible for end user training. This is a pretty common assumption, by the way. And the assumption is that they will train a core team of people, but that core team of people internally within the organization is responsible for going out and training all the end users. And that's a fair assumption. A lot of vendors do it, but there's a cost associated with that. There's a cost for you to invest in people within your organization that are going to go out and train the troops on how to use the new technologies. And if you don't account for that cost, you're going to underestimate what your overall cost of ownership is for that solution. And then over here, if you have another provider that says, we'll do all the training for you, their cost might actually be higher and more realistic. But again, when you compare it to the other vendor, it may look like they're more expensive when in reality they might not be. So it's important to understand and recognize what these hidden costs are, not just in terms of what costs might drive up the cost of the software procurement itself or the technical services, but also those internal costs, those other third-party costs around data migration, process improvement, integration to third-party systems. Those are just a few examples of the types of activities that can add to your cost structure for an implementation, but they may be hidden or not identified in the overall procurement process if you don't know what to look for. The good news with procuring ERP software is that the software itself is relatively black and white. It's relatively easy to understand which modules you are or are not getting. People oftentimes make mistakes in these areas, but it's a little bit more cut and dry than the services side. When we get into the services side, the proposal of what it's going to take to actually implement the software, this is where you tend to see a lot of mistakes in the procurement cycle. Partially because you have different methodologies, you have different assumptions, you have different ways of rolling out the technology, things that may or may not be affiliated or associated with the software itself, but it's with the software or the technology provider that you're procuring the services from. So this is where on the services side, the overall implementation timeline and duration, you really want to compare evenly the two proposals or the series of proposals that you receive from the technology consultants or the technology providers. Because chances are high that if one vendor is saying they can implement in 18 months and then another vendor is saying they can implement in 9 months, it's hard for me to believe that the technology is that different or that much better or easier to implement that one could be done in 9 months versus 18. So that's a good red flag that you want to dig into that and understand why is there such a discrepancy here between these two timelines. Same with the implementation cost estimate. If you have two materially different implementation proposal costs, then there's probably something wrong that can't quite be attributed to just the software itself. There must be something with the assumptions, with the quality of resources, maybe with the rate structure of the consultants they're using. Whatever the case may be, you want to dig in and understand and make sure that you're identifying what the real cost of their proposal is, because oftentimes software vendors are going to underestimate the cost as a sales tactic to show that their software is less expensive than some of the other competition out there. And the more competitive the situation, the more you have multiple vendors in the picture, the more expansive your RFP process is, the more likely it is that you're going to run into this dynamic where you're going to get someone who comes in and just completely lowballs their cost as a way to get their foot in the door, knowing that if they lowball the cost now and win the deal, they could probably make it up with change orders and increase their revenue later on. It might be good for them, but it's not good for you. So you want to make sure you identify that stuff up front and really rationalize and normalize these implementation proposals as much as you possibly can. Another thing I'll mention here as it relates to mistakes in the ERP procurement process is when you've completed the procurement process, what happens next. And I know technically this isn't about procurement, this is what happens after the procurement, but this is really important because this happens a lot with organizations. What you don't want to do is you don't want to just jump straight into the implementation the minute you sign the contract with the software provider and the technology service provider. The reason for that is because you need to mobilize your own internal team. You need to make sure you have an overall program plan in place. You need to make sure you have the right governance and controls in place. You need to make sure that you have the other third parties in place that you're going to need to make your project successful. So if you have a data expert you need to bring in, or a change management team you need to bring in, or an independent third party like our company at Third Stage, if you need to bring in program managers, whatever the case may be, you need to make sure you have all that stuff in place and that you don't let the meter start running on the technology providers until you have that stuff in place, because otherwise you're going to waste a lot of time and money spinning your wheels and investing in things that aren't adding value if you're not ready for the implementation to begin. So what happens right after the procurement process is really important. You want to make sure you don't rush straight into the implementation. You want to make sure you take some time to do this implementation phase 0 planning phase. And if you'd like to learn more about what that phase 0 plan should look like, I encourage you to watch this video right here. It gives you an overview of phase 0 and what it means to your overall digital transformation. So I hope this has provided some guidance on understanding some of the common mistakes and pitfalls that organizations make during their ERP software procurement process and the RFP process. If you like to bounce around ideas of how to ensure that you're getting a realistic set of proposals, or if you have questions about your procurement process, or if you're not sure what it is you're seeing from vendors, if it's real, feel free to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below. I'd be happy to be an informal sounding board for you as you continue your journey and as you go through the digital transformation process. So I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day. ERP implementation, but it's also one of the most okay.